The summer of 1842 in the Mississippi Delta was thick with heat and heavy with expectation. Cedar Hill Plantation, seat of the wealthy Hollingsworth family, had never seen such a celebration. Word spread across Yazoo County that James Hollingsworth, heir to one of the richest cotton dynasties in the South, was to wed Catherine Beecham, daughter of a planter whose land stretched clear to the Louisiana border. For planters, marriage was never only love, it was empire. Two fortunes joining meant more land, more bodies in chains, more cotton shipped downriver to New Orleans, and more power secured in the legislature halls of Jackson. The wedding was a spectacle by every account that survives, though the records are fragmented, singed, or silenced. Still, scraps remain. A letter from a distant cousin, preserved in a Beecham family chest and later sold at auction in 1912, reads, "The table groaned under the feast, there was laughter and toasts, and all seemed blessed of Providence." What that cousin could not know or dared not say, was that beneath the silver platters, beneath the golden candlelight, beneath the perfume of roses and roasted quail, a different hand had shaped the night's destiny. The cook of Cedar Hill, listed in ledgers only as Sarah, age 36, mulatto, skilled in household service, had stood in the kitchen all day. She baked the bread, spiced the meats, sweetened the wines with sugared syrups. Every movement of her hands had been watched, yet none could guess that this woman, stripped of family, of freedom, of name beyond what ink had branded in the planter's book, would deliver a justice no court in Mississippi would ever sanction. According to a half-burned county court ledger dated 1847, found in Yazoo's courthouse archives before the fire of 1856 destroyed most records, on the night of June 12 in the year of our Lord 1842, there was incident of sudden death most grievous, in number more than a dozen, at the household of James Hollingsworth, lately married. 'Cause not ascertained, but suspicion fell upon the Negro cook, property of said estate. The words are stiff, cold, bureaucratic. Yet behind them one can hear the gasps, the choking, the shrieks echoing off polished wood. The long oak table glittered with candlesticks. Silk gowns rustled as the bride's party laughed over wine imported from France. The groom raised a toast to prosperity, his father boasting of their cotton yields, their blood-soaked fortune. But as the glasses touched lips, the air thickened with dread. First came the coughs, then the heaving. One planter's wife fell forward into her plate of candied yams, her lace veil darkening with bile. A guest at the far end staggered up, clutching at his throat as his face blued. Another collapsed into the cake itself, his body twitching as the frosting smeared across his cheeks. An excerpt from the Charleston Gazette months later coyly reported, "Rumors of a food sickness most untimely in the household of Hollingsworth, though particulars are scarce and unreliable." The Gazette did not print the number of dead, nor the name of the cook, nor the fact that the bride herself collapsed to the floor before the cake was even cut, her white gloves stained crimson with blood. Witnesses claimed that Sarah was not in the kitchen when the convulsions began. Some said she had stepped outside into the dark, standing beneath the willow tree where her children once played. Others whispered she watched from the shadows, silent as the masters choked. No one recorded her words that night if she spoke at all. The court ledger only marks, "She confessed nothing." But the silence itself speaks. It is the silence of generations denied a voice, pressed into obedience, beaten into submission. On that night in the Hollingsworth dining room, silence turned to fire. What makes the massacre so haunting is not merely the deaths themselves, but the absence, the deliberate erasure of their record. In the plantation books, the page where that feast should be marked is torn clean. In the county death rolls, the cause is listed only as sudden malady. And in family Bibles handed down through descendants, the date June 12, 1842, is often missing altogether, the pages carefully cut. Why erase it if it was only food gone bad? Why burn ledgers, silence newspapers, and bury witnesses? Because it was not madness. It was not accident. It was resistance, raw, unflinching, and terrifying to those who built their lives on the backs of others. The massacre at the Hollingsworth wedding was not meant for history books. It was meant to be forgotten the way Sarah herself was meant to be forgotten. But fragments survive, whispered in songs, scratched into margins, remembered in silences at the dinner table of descendants who knew not to ask why their grandmother never spoke of that wedding night again. And so the question lingers, rising from the ashes of burned records and erased ledgers. Was Sarah a murderer or a soldier in a war no one dared to name? Was she consumed by vengeance, or did she strike with the only weapon left to a woman chained by law, stripped of every right, and watching her children stolen by violence? The Hollingsworths called it crime. The newspapers called it sickness. The court called it malady. But the enslaved, The ones who hummed songs in the dark, who told their children stories of a cook who dared to season the feast with justice. They remembered it as something else. A reckoning. And it is that reckoning we drag into the light tonight, from the shadows of half-burned ledgers and the whispered prayers of those who would not let the story die. If you've ever heard whispers of this family name, if your grandmother told you of a wedding never spoken of again, write it below. And subscribe, because every comment brings another lost record back to life. Cedar Hill Plantation rose out of the Mississippi earth like a fortress of wealth and cruelty, its columns whitewashed, its fields stretching farther than the eye could see, an empire built not of stone or marble but of sweat, blood, and the broken backs of the enslaved. To speak of the massacre without first speaking of the land is to tell only half the story, for it was the land itself, fertile, green, and cruelly unforgiving, that shaped the lives of both master and slave, binding them together in chains of profit and suffering. The census of 1840 lists Cedar Hill as home to over 300 enslaved people, their names absent, their humanity reduced to crude numbers scratched in ink. 312 Negroes, 46 housed in quarters. The line reads as though they were cattle, as though their lives and children in grief could be tallied like sacks of cotton. Agricultural reports from the Yazoo County Courthouse, brittle and water-stained, estimate the plantation's cotton yield at nearly 2,000 bales per year, a fortune that flowed downriver to New Orleans, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, feeding the textile mills of England and the greed of the American South. But within the wealth of the Hollingsworth estate lay suffering so deep it seeped into the soil itself. Overseer diaries, one belonging to a man named Thomas Pritchard, a name scrawled in brown ink across the cracked leather cover, reveal a cold philosophy of rule. In an entry dated August 1839 he wrote, "Discipline by lash ensures obedience. Mercy is weakness. The Negro learns not by kindness but by pain." In another, dated February 1841, 2 runaways brought back this morning. One lashed 20, the other 30 strokes. Left them in the stocks until sunset. The quarters were little more than wooden shacks, roofs leaking rain, floors of hard-packed earth. An abolitionist traveler passing through Yazoo County in 1841 described them as rooms barely fit for swine, yet housing whole families, their air rank with smoke and despair. In those huts, mothers nursed children while praying silently that the next sale would not claim them. Fathers told stories of Africa or whispered scripture in the dark, even as their own backs bore scars from the lash. The plantation ledger lists tools, seed, mules, wagons, and in the same breath, it lists children. Boy, age 6, sound $100. Girl, age 3, frail $25. The wealth of Cedar Hill was not abstract. It was visible in every polished brick of the main house, every glass decanter on the dining table, every silk gown worn by the Hollingsworth daughters. But its cost was also visible, in the calloused hands of field workers who bled into the cotton they picked, in the crooked backs of men worked until their spines bent, in the empty eyes of women forced to serve meals they would never taste. Every morsel of luxury consumed at the wedding feast had been paid for in human suffering. The Hollingsworth family themselves were considered paragons of planter society. Court records describe James Hollingsworth, the groom of that ill-fated wedding, as a gentleman of fine standing, educated, industrious. His father, Charles Hollingsworth, was noted in county ledgers as a man of property, devoted to the prosperity of Mississippi. But prosperity in this land meant cruelty hidden behind civility. A letter from a neighboring planter, preserved in a family archive, praises Charles Hollingsworth for his firm hand with the Negroes and his keen sense for profit. Nowhere in these accounts is there a whisper of mercy. And yet, the enslaved noticed everything. Oral histories collected nearly a century later by the Works Progress Administration tell of a Hollingsworth plantation, where the lash was quicker than the smile, where singing in the field brought punishment, and where the cook's hands trembled with rage she dared not show. These accounts describe the land as rich in cotton but cursed with sorrow, a place where the soil itself seemed to cry out against the weight of chains pressed into it. The geography of Cedar Hill made it both a prison and a fortress. Encircled by the Yazoo River on one side and dense woods on the other, escape was nearly impossible. Advertisements in the Natchez Courier from 1838 list runaway slaves, belonging to the Hollingsworth estate, describing them in cold detail. Elias, age about 25, mulatto, scar across right cheek, speaks little. Dinah, age 20, small in stature, quick of foot. Rewards of up to $100 were offered for their capture, with warnings that those aiding said runaways shall be prosecuted. Every chain, every ledger, every lash tied Cedar Hill more tightly to its wealth, and tied its enslaved more deeply to despair. But despair is never the whole story. In the corners of the quarters, in the shadows of the fields, the enslaved carved out fragments of humanity. They shared cornbread when rations failed, they taught children to hum songs that carried coded warnings, they whispered the names of ancestors so that the masters could not erase memory entirely. And always they watched. They watched the masters boast, the overseers strut, the guests arrive in finery. They watched and they remembered. The massacre of 1842 did not erupt from nothing. It grew from this land, from the endless cruelty disguised as civility, from the chains masked by whitewashed columns. To understand the wedding feast, one must understand Cedar Hill itself, a world built on chains, polished with wealth and rotting with injustice. And so we leave this section of the story not with the glitter of the Hollingsworth mansion, but with the silent gaze of those whose names were reduced to ink and numbers. For in their silence, in their resilience, and in their rage, the seeds of that wedding night's reckoning were sown. In the Hollingsworth ledger, kept in the family's mahogany desk until fragments of it surfaced at auction in the early 20th century, there is a single line dated May 1826, purchased from New Orleans market. Sarah, age 20, mulatto, skilled cook, $450. The handwriting is neat, the valuation precise, and yet in that small notation lies the tearing apart of an entire life. For in that moment, Sarah ceased to be a daughter, ceased to be a wife, ceased to be the free soul her mother once carried in chains across the Atlantic. She became, in the eyes of the law and the planter class, an entry in a book. But ledgers never tell the full story. They do not describe the way Sarah's hair curled in the humid heat of the Mississippi Delta, or how her hands bore calluses not just from stirring pots but from cradling children at night. They do not note that she sang as she cooked, humming fragments of old hymns, some smuggled from Africa, others absorbed from plantation preachers who offered salvation even as the lash split skin. They do not record the tears she shed when her children were born, nor the silent rage when they were threatened. The records show Sarah's children only in passing. In an 1830 bill of sale, the Hollingsworth account notes, child Elias, born to Sarah, age 2, valued at $75. A later line in 1835, girl Dinah, born age not yet 1, frail. In the margins, the figures are scratched out, overwritten as though their existence itself were inconvenient. 4 masters, children were wealth in the making. Future hands for the fields, future lives to sell at auction when debts pressed too heavily. To mothers, they were flesh of their flesh, reminders that even in chains, life insisted on blooming. A will from Charles Hollingsworth, written in 1839, describes how household property would be divided among his heirs. The term property encompassed wagons, silverware, and human beings alike. Within that will, Sarah is mentioned not by name but by function. The cook shall remain attached to the household, her offspring to be apportioned as deemed useful. That cold phrasing masked a cruel reality. Sarah's husband, a man called Samuel in the ledgers, was sold downriver to Louisiana in the same year. He disappears entirely after that, likely swallowed by the sugar plantations of the bayou, where life expectancy for the enslaved was counted in years, not decades. Sarah never saw him again. Baptismal records from a traveling Methodist preacher in Yazoo County note that one of Sarah's children, unnamed in the church book, died before the age of 3. The space for cause of death is left blank, a silence more telling than words. In those same records, scribbled notes mention mothers weeping quietly at the riverbank baptisms, afraid their babies would be taken, but still desperate to see them blessed before the inevitable separation. These records are thin, brittle, but they are the only fragments of humanity left in a system that fought to erase it. To the Hollingsworths, Sarah was valuable because she was skilled. She prepared their meals, laid their tables, baked their bread. To the ledgers that was her purpose. But within the quarters, among her own people, she was more. Oral accounts passed down long after the Civil War describe a woman who fed not just her masters but also her neighbors in the quarters, slipping bits of food to hungry children, sharing what little she could. They describe her as a woman who prayed with her eyes open, always watching, always wary, always carrying within her a fire she dared not show. Her children were her anchor. Elias, described in a runaway ad years later as sturdy, mulatto, age 12, sharp-eyed, was said to have inherited his father's quiet strength. Dinah, barely 7 when the wedding feast was planned, was remembered by elders interviewed in the 1930s as quick-footed, a girl who could outrun her shadows. The fact that their names survived at all, whispered through generations, is testimony to the resistance of memory against erasure. The plantation's bookkeeping reduced this family to scratches of ink, but those scratches could not contain the fullness of their lives. In the evenings, Sarah was said to tell her children stories of rivers that led to freedom, of ancestors who walked proud before the ships came. She would weave the tales into her cooking, seasoning not just the food but the minds of her children with hope. And yet each night as the lamps were blown out, she knew that hope lived under constant threat: the lash, the auction block, the casual cruelty of a master's whim. The Hollingsworth estate saw Sarah as an asset to be controlled, her children as investments to be calculated. But the story of Cedar Hill cannot be told without acknowledging that these numbers, these ledgers, these lines of ink concealed hearts that beat, eyes that watched, and spirits that endured. By 1842, when the wedding feast was planned, Sarah had lived 16 years in bondage under the Hollingsworths. 16 years of serving meals she did not taste, of watching her children counted like coin, of remembering the husband torn from her arms. 16 years of swallowing rage so that her children might survive one more day. The ledgers say nothing of her sorrow, but sorrow was written into every lash mark, every empty cradle, every name crossed out by the planter's hand. And it is here, in the fragile humanity of one woman and her family, that the massacre finds its roots. For the massacre was not the act of a faceless servant, nor of a shadow in the kitchen, but of a mother, a widow, a survivor whose name survives only in fragments, yet whose choices would shake an entire plantation to its core. The records tell us Sarah was property. But the truth, whispered in kitchens, passed down in secret songs, remembered in silences, tells us she was a mother, a wife, a woman who dared to carve her family's story into the blood-soaked soil of Mississippi. And when that soil drank the blood of the Hollingsworths at the wedding table, it was not random. It was the ledger itself being torn open, its cold lines rewritten by the very hands it sought to erase. To live enslaved at Cedar Hill was to live in a world where every breath, every step, every thought was claimed by another. Dawn began not with the sun but with the crack of the overseer's whip. The air split open before light touched the cotton fields. Men, women, and children rose from their pallet beds in the quarters, their stomachs hollow, their limbs aching from the day before. They stepped out into the dirt, eyes lowered, bodies bent, because any sign of defiance, even in posture, could earn a lashing. The rhythm of life was relentless. The men filed to the fields, bent double beneath the rising heat, fingers bleeding as they plucked the sharp cotton bolls. Overseer records describe the quotas demanded: 200 pounds of cotton per worker per day in harvest season, failure punishable by lash. A single line in Thomas Pritchard's diary for October 1841 reads coldly, 3 failed quota. Administered correction. Left 2 unable to stand. The women's labor was no less brutal. They worked beside the men in the fields until called into the house, where they scrubbed, sewed, and cooked, their days stretching from dawn until well after the masters dined. Sarah's place was in the kitchen, where the fire never died and the master's appetites never ceased. From before sunrise until deep into the night, she stirred, chopped, kneaded, and baked, her hands raw from heat and knives, her back aching from bending over pots that were never her own. For the enslaved, hunger was constant. Meals were meager: cornmeal mush, scraps of salted pork, beans boiled thin. The best of everything went to the big house, where the Hollingsworths feasted on roasted game, sugared fruits, imported wines. Overseer accounts mention food only as inventory: 2 barrels cornmeal, 1 hog slaughtered, quarter for the Negroes. And yet, in the quarters, mothers stretched these rations into meals, sharing, trading, teaching children to savor what little they had. Sarah was known to slip pieces of bread from the kitchen to hungry mouths when she could, small acts of defiance hidden in the folds of her apron. The lash hung over every life like a shadow. Punishments were public, designed to break not just the body of the one whipped but the spirit of those forced to watch. Overseer Pritchard wrote of discipline gatherings, where the enslaved were lined up to witness lashings, the cries echoing in their ears long after the bleeding stopped. Children, too young to understand, learned early that silence was safer than sympathy, that turning away could save them from becoming the next example. But even in silence, resistance lived. Songs rose in the fields, slow and mournful, their lyrics layered with hidden meaning. To the overseers they were chants to pass the time. To those who sang them they were prayers, codes, and warnings. A verse might sound like a lament, but in its rhythm lay directions for escape, or messages about where food was hidden, or simply the stubborn reminder that voices could not be entirely silenced. Prayer meetings, held in secret beneath the cover of night, became sanctuaries of endurance. Preachers chosen from among the enslaved would speak by firelight, calling out from Exodus, the story of Moses and Pharaoh, the promise of deliverance. These gatherings were illegal, punishable by flogging, yet they persisted. The Hollingsworth records mention Negro unrest and suspicious night gatherings, but they never captured the depth of hope whispered in those woods. The greatest tool of survival, however, was silence. To endure meant to hide anger behind bowed heads, to swallow curses behind forced smiles, to mask grief with obedience. Silence was armor. It shielded mothers who plotted to protect their children, fathers who dreamed of running, cooks who measured every motion in the kitchen, waiting for a day when silence could be broken. Overseers mistook silence for submission. They failed to see it was a waiting place, a gathering storm. Sarah lived in this silence. Each day she bowed her head, took orders, endured insults. But inside, a fire smoldered. She listened as her daughter Dinah cried at night from hunger or fear. She watched her son Elias learn to bow too quickly, his eyes too careful. She remembered Samuel, her husband, sold downriver, his absence a wound that never healed. The ledgers record her as sullen. That word, preserved in the overseer's diary, reveals more than he intended. Sullen was his word for resistance. Sullen was the mask she wore to keep her fury hidden until the moment she chose to unleash it. Every plate she prepared for the Hollingsworths was a reminder of her bondage. Every roast carved, every cake frosted, every glass poured was a performance of obedience demanded by those who owned her body. And yet, the act of cooking also gave her knowledge. Knowledge of herbs, of roots, of powders that could heal or harm. It was in the kitchen that she mastered more than recipes. She mastered the art of control, of patience, of waiting for the right moment. Life under the yoke was not just survival. It was a crucible. Day after day, year after year, Sarah was pressed, beaten, silenced, but not destroyed. The weight of oppression forged in her a resilience so sharp it would one day cut through the Hollingsworth dynasty itself. In the quiet hours after the work was done, when the fires dimmed and the quarters grew still, Sarah sat with her children. She told them stories of a world beyond the fields, of ancestors who walked free, of a God who did not forget. She sang softly, her voice carrying fragments of hope into the night. The children listened, wide-eyed, their futures uncertain, their survival tied to a mother who held her rage close like a blade hidden in cloth. The Hollingsworths believed silence meant submission. But silence can be more dangerous than screams. It is silence that watches, waits, remembers, and strikes when least expected. And on that wedding night in 1842, the silence broke. The months leading up to the Hollingsworth wedding were marked not by celebration in the quarters, but by a tightening of the yoke. Winter came cold that year, raw winds slicing through the thin walls of the slave cabins, the kind of cold that turned sickness into death. Overseer Pritchard's journal for January 1842 notes bluntly, 3 infants buried. Mothers too weak for the field's excused half-day. No mention of names, no mention of grief, just numbers tallied like livestock. Sarah carried this winter in her bones. Her youngest child, Dinah, had grown frail, coughing deep in her chest. Each night, Sarah begged God to spare her daughter, rocking her against a breast gone lean from rationed meals. But when Dinah's fever worsened, Sarah went to the big house, kneeling before Mrs. Hollingsworth to plead for a doctor. The mistress, dressed in silks and pearls for a gathering, looked down at her with a face as cold as the marble hearth. Doctors are expensive. She'll either get better or she won't. Don't bother me again. Dinah died 2 nights later. The cemetery beyond the fields held row upon row of unmarked graves. Sarah laid her child into the earth, the dirt damp and heavy in her hands, her tears falling where no marker would stand. The record books say nothing of Dinah. In the ledger she was erased with a line, 1 female child, deceased. But in Sarah's heart, the loss carved a hollow that no silence could contain. If grief alone could break a woman, perhaps she would have bent, but grief turned to fury when coupled with cruelty. Only weeks after Dinah's burial, the Hollingsworth master announced the grand wedding of his only son, Edward, to the daughter of a wealthy cotton baron from Louisiana. Preparations began at once, and Sarah, as head cook, was ordered to oversee the feast. Everything must be perfect, Pritchard recorded. No error tolerated. The family's name depends upon it. The irony burned her. Her child had been deemed unworthy of the price of a doctor, yet no expense was spared for roasted pheasants, sugared almonds, and wine shipped from France. She stirred pots heavy with meat while her son Elias gnawed on cornbread scraps. She watched flour sifted white for the wedding cake, knowing she would carry nothing home but a crust. Injustice was not new to her, but the sharpness of it now pierced deeper because it was sharpened by loss. What turned grief into action, however, was not the death of Dinah alone, nor the cruelty of her mistress. It was the violation of Elias. One spring evening, when Sarah returned from the kitchen to the quarters, she found her boy trembling, his shirt torn. Another enslaved woman, Auntie Ruth, whispered the truth in her ear. The master's son, drunk from celebrating his upcoming wedding, had dragged Elias into the barn. Overseer notes from that night omit the crime but mention discipline issues and a punishment order for uncooperative youth. The ledger hides what the child endured. Oral accounts, passed down in hushed tones among descendants, preserve it more clearly. Elias was abused and Sarah knew it. This was the breaking point. The fire that had smoldered through years of silence erupted into something more than grief, more than anger. It became resolve. Sarah had always known the kitchen's secrets. She knew which herbs healed fever, which calmed the stomach, which could still a man's heart if boiled long enough and slipped into stew. Enslaved women were keepers of knowledge, passed in whispers from mother to daughter, secrets the masters never understood because they never asked. Sarah began to gather quietly, roots dug from the edges of fields, leaves collected under cover of night, powders traded with field hands who knew the woods better than the overseers. There was danger in this. If she was caught, the punishment would be beyond imagining. Runaway slave ads in the Charleston Gazette often described fugitives scarred by iron collars or missing ears, punishments for lesser acts than poisoning. But danger had already come to her door. Her child was gone, another had been broken, and her body had nothing left to lose. The weeks before the wedding became her preparation. By day she worked as ordered, kneading dough, roasting meats, testing sauces while the mistress scolded and the master planned. By night she whispered prayers in the dark, asking God if vengeance could be justice, if her hands might serve not as instruments of cruelty but of deliverance. Folklore suggests she may have visited a conjure woman, one of the hidden root workers who moved in shadows along the Mississippi. Though no court record confirms it, descendants speak of a woman called Aunt Celia, known for her knowledge of poisons. Whether Sarah met her or not, the whispers suggest she carried not only grief but the weight of ancestral wisdom into the kitchen. On the eve of the wedding, Pritchard noted in his journal, "All in readiness. Cook appears composed, though sullen as always." He did not see the storm beneath her face. He did not hear the whispered name of Dinah spoken as Sarah stirred the final pot. He did not sense that silence had sharpened into a blade, and that the hand which served would soon strike with more precision than any whip. What makes the act haunting is not merely that she poisoned a feast, but the path that led her there. The overseer's ledgers record quotas, punishments, inventories. The newspapers carried notices of runaway slaves and plantation marriages. But what they could not capture was the breaking of a mother's heart, the silent rage of a woman who buried her child in unmarked earth and cradled her son's shame in the darkness. The Hollingsworths believed the wedding would mark the height of their dynasty, binding their wealth to another powerful family. Instead, it became the stage upon which Sarah would carve her vengeance into history. And so, when the candles were lit and the silver laid, when the guests in lace and velvet filled the dining hall, Sarah stood in the kitchen doorway, her face hidden in shadow, watching. She had prepared every dish, touched every glass, poured every drop. What came next was not madness nor impulse. It was the inevitable breaking of silence. The wedding feast was no celebration. It was the reckoning she had chosen. The night of March 12, 1842, fell soft upon Cedar Hill Plantation. Lanterns glowed along the carriage road, their light glimmering against the polished wheels of buggies arriving from all across Yazoo County. The Hollingsworth house was a beacon of wealth that evening, its windows lit like a cathedral, music spilling into the night air. From the upstairs rooms came the laughter of young women in silk gowns, the clinking of glasses, the boasts of men fattened on cotton and profit. Inside, the dining room table stretched nearly the length of the hall, draped in white linen, its surface glittering with silver and china imported from France. 1,000 candles flickered across mirrors, multiplying light into brilliance. Guests marveled at the abundance. Roasted venison, quail stuffed with chestnuts, tureens of spiced stew, sugared fruit, a towering cake layered high with cream. No expense had been spared, no cruelty remembered. To them, it was a triumph of Southern wealth, a union of two dynasties that would ensure generations of prosperity. But in the kitchen, behind the swinging doors, Sarah stood with her sleeves rolled, hands steady, face composed. She had touched every dish, seasoned every pot, tasted every broth. The knowledge of what she had done lay heavy but certain in her chest. 4 days she had prepared the feast with patience, her fingers measuring not only salt and spice, but powders gathered in secret, crushed roots, bitter leaves, a resinous dust known to enslaved women whose healing knowledge was also the knowledge of harm. According to a charred fragment of a Yazoo County court ledger, Rescued decades later from a courthouse fire, one line records the night in stark brevity. By midnight, nearly all present were struck with violent convulsions. Cause disputed. Another, more cryptic notation appears in the same hand. Suspicion fell upon the cook, female, property of Hollingsworth estate. Nothing more. No trial notes, no names of the dead. But whispers carried through time paint a fuller picture. The feast began with laughter. Wine poured freely, goblets raised high. The bride, no more than 17, glowed under candlelight, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Musicians played a reel in the corner as servants moved silently between courses. Sarah herself carried dishes to the table, her eyes lowered, her movements practiced. None suspected. The first signs came subtle. A guest, mid-laughter, pressed his hand to his stomach, frowning as though something sat ill. Another coughed violently, wine spilling across his lap. At first, the hall dismissed it, bad wine, nerves, too much food. But within moments, the laughter soured into confusion. One man collapsed face first into his venison, silver fork clattering to the floor. Another retched violently onto the linen. Panic spread as cries rose around the table. The bride shrieked as her new husband lurched from his chair, his body convulsing, froth at his lips. According to a later account whispered by a field hand and recorded in WPA oral histories, they fell one after the other, like corn cut in a row. Plates overturned, goblets shattered, guests clawed at their throats, their eyes wide with terror. Sarah stood in the doorway, half in shadow, half in the candle's glow. Some say she did not move, only watched as the room dissolved into chaos. Others insist she whispered the name of her dead child, Dinah, as the masters who denied her medicine now begged for air, clawing at the floorboards. The overseer's diary for March 1842 contains a single entry, cryptic and hurried: calamity at supper. Losses severe. Master near death. Cause unrecorded. The next page is torn away. Whether by fire, by deliberate erasure, or by shame, the record is broken. What we know from folklore is that not all who sat at the table died that night. Some lingered for hours, vomiting, crying out, their bodies writhing as the poison worked its way through. Torches were lit as chaos spilled into the yard, guests collapsing on the steps, servants rushing in confusion. The bride, it is said, convulsed in her white gown, a vision as haunting as any ghost tale whispered in the quarters for generations to come. For Sarah the act was not frenzy but reckoning. She had cooked for them her entire life, served their wealth, their greed, their cruelty. That night she turned her skill into a weapon. Every dish that fed them was a dish that condemned them. She gave back, not in silence but in fire and poison. The whitewashed walls of Cedar Hill would never again shine so brightly. By morning the plantation was draped not in celebration but in death. A later article in the Natchez Gazette, dated April 1842, refers obliquely to a tragic illness that struck a prominent family in Yazoo County during a wedding feast, claiming the deaths were caused by tainted oysters imported from New Orleans. Nowhere is Sarah's name mentioned. Nowhere is the possibility of deliberate act acknowledged. The truth was buried under polite lies, the kind that smoothed over scandal with whispers of food gone bad. But the enslaved carried a different memory. WPA interviews from the 1930s record an elder named Martha, who spoke of her grandmother's time at Cedar Hill. They say the cook done it. Say she put something in the pot. White folks hushed it up, but we remembered. We always remembered. History tried to erase that night, through fire, through altered newspapers, through missing ledgers. Yet silence cannot bury everything. It lingers in folklore, in half-burned court records, in whispers passed from grandmother to grandchild. The massacre at the wedding feast was not just an act of vengeance. It was a statement carved into the heart of Cedar Hill, that the enslaved, though bound by chains, though silenced by whips, could still strike back with a power the masters never imagined. And in the silence that followed, as the candles burned low and the cries of the dying echoed into the Mississippi night, Sarah's face was said to remain calm, unshaken, as though the weight of years had finally lifted. The act itself may never be fully captured by records, but its shadow remains. It was a night the Hollingsworth family never spoke of again, a night newspapers reduced to tainted oysters, a night that proved justice could rise from the kitchen pot, even if it took the shape of poison. And as dawn broke over Cedar Hill, the question lingered: was this madness, or was it the only justice left? By dawn, Cedar Hill Plantation was no longer the shining beacon of Southern wealth it had been the night before. The white columns that once gleamed in candlelight now stood over a house thick with the stench of vomit, blood, and fear. The Hollingsworth wedding feast, meant to bind two dynasties, had unraveled into something the county could not ignore, the sudden violent collapse of Mississippi's planter order, if only for a single night. But the masters did not weep long. Their sorrow curdled into vengeance, swift and merciless. According to militia records preserved in the Yazoo County archives, though many pages are charred and entire sections missing, a call to arms was issued before noon. Captain Jeremiah Wills of the county patrol recorded, "Urgent need for immediate response. Suspected foul play in the Hollingsworth household. Negro cook apprehended. Militia dispatched to secure quarters." His handwriting trembles as though written in haste, blotches of ink smudging the page. The militia descended upon Cedar Hill like wolves. Oral testimony gathered nearly a century later tells of mounted men, rifles gleaming in the sun, storming the quarters, kicking in doors, dragging men, women, and children into the yard. Elias, Sarah's surviving son, was said to have clung to his mother's skirts until he was torn away. The enslaved were forced to kneel in rows, overseers barking accusations, guns pointed at their backs. The punishment began before any investigation. Overseer Pritchard's diary, one of the few sources surviving, notes on March 13, 1842, at least 9 Negroes flogged before noon. Several confessed under duress to knowledge of the plot. Cook silent. Refused speech. Ordered confinement. Silent she remained. No pleading, no denial, no cry for mercy. Witnesses later claimed Sarah held her chin high, even as lashes cracked across her shoulders, even as the mistress of the house stood weeping in rage. One WPA account from a woman named Hester, whose grandmother lived on Cedar Hill, recalls, "They say she never screamed. Not once. She just looked at them like she knew something they didn't." But silence did not shield the others. Retaliation spread beyond the kitchen. Dozens of enslaved men were tied to posts and whipped until flesh hung in ribbons. Women were dragged into the fields, accused of aiding Sarah, of knowing her plan. The militia needed no evidence. The act of survival itself was enough to condemn. The executions began by evening. A crude gallows was built at the edge of the cotton fields, timber dragged from barns, rope twisted hastily by overseers' hands. At least 5 men were hanged that night, their bodies left swaying in the wind as a warning. County court notes, filed weeks later, refer only to removals necessary for security. Names are absent, replaced by cold numbers. 5 Negro men dispatched. 1 cook confined for trial. But oral memory preserved more than numbers. Descendants whispered names into the dark. Isaiah, field hand, father of 3. Ruth's boy Samuel, barely 17. Ben, the blacksmith whose strength forged the plantation's tools. They did not vanish quietly. They were taken, punished, erased in ink, but remembered in song. The Hollingsworth family, though wounded, did not die entirely that night. The groom survived, though some accounts claim he walked with a limp for the rest of his days. The bride lived too, her beauty forever shadowed by whispers of the poisoned feast. Those who had not perished demanded revenge in full, and the county gave it to them. By the week's end, Cedar Hill's quarters were half empty. Some enslaved fled into the woods, hunted by dogs and patrols. Others were sold off quickly, scattered to plantations across the Delta so that no trace of rebellion might remain concentrated in one place. The Hollingsworth ledgers for April 1842 list more than 30 names crossed out, replaced with the word sold, ink thick and deliberate. The cook, Sarah, remained in custody. Her fate was to be decided in the courthouse, but her trial would not be fair, nor her story preserved honestly. The newspapers of the time, careful to protect planter society, framed the event as a tragedy of misfortune. The Natchez Gazette and Charleston Mercury both printed nearly identical lines. A family gathering in Yazoo County was struck with sudden illness, believed to be caused by spoiled shellfish. Rumors of darker cause have been dismissed as idle talk. Spoiled shellfish. That was the polite mask placed upon the screams of the dying. But among the enslaved, the story carried a different weight. They spoke of Sarah's silence, of her unflinching gaze, of the justice she carved into the heart of Cedar Hill. The aftermath was brutal, yes. Blood was spilled, families shattered, lives ended on rope and lash. But even in that terror, the enslaved carried a kernel of something forbidden: pride. Pride that one of their own had struck back in a way no whip could erase. It is here that the record bends. History written by masters tells of illness and discipline. Folklore whispers of vengeance and courage. Somewhere between the burned courthouse files and the trembling voice of a granddaughter remembering her grandmother's story, the truth endures. The aftermath was not just punishment, it was suppression. Suppression of voices, of names, of memory. Yet every act of erasure leaves behind shadows, and shadows linger. As the body swayed in the Mississippi wind and the quarters echoed with silence, one question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but felt by all who survived. Had justice been served in poison, or had cruelty simply reclaimed its throne in blood? The trial of Sarah, the Hollingsworth cook, began in late March of 1842 in the Yazoo County Courthouse, a brick building that still stands, its walls weathered, its records charred and incomplete. By the time she was dragged through its doors, her back bore scars from weeks of flogging, her wrists swollen from iron cuffs. Yet accounts, fragmentary as they are, say she walked with her head high, her silence as sharp as any blade. The official docket from March 28, 1842, survives only in fragments, discovered decades later in the rubble of a courthouse fire. The surviving page reads, Case number 117, Sarah, female Negro, property of Hollingsworth Estate. Accused of malicious poisoning resulting in death. Trial convened before Judge Horace Whitfield. Jury impaneled, 12 white men, all property holders. No further pages exist, or at least none have been preserved. But from scattered letters, diaries, and whispers carried through generations, the shape of the trial emerges. It was not justice. It was theater. According to the Vicksburg Register, which reported obliquely on the matter under the headline Tragedy in Yazoo, the court was satisfied with ample evidence of Sarah's guilt, though it did not describe what that evidence was. No witness was named. No confession was recorded. Overseer Pritchard testified, swearing under oath that the cook did behave with suspicion, showing sullenness before the feast, and was seen near the pots when the stews were boiling. Another planter swore he had once heard her mutter curses in the quarters. These were not proofs but shadows, yet in a court where her skin and her chains defined her guilt, shadows were more than enough. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. But what haunts the record is not what was said, it is what was not. Nowhere is Sarah's voice preserved. The court transcripts, if they ever existed, carry only the words of white men. Whether she spoke in her defense, whether she named the children she buried, whether she shouted or whispered or remained silent, history does not say. All that remains is a note in the margin of an 1847 abstract. Cook refused to speak throughout proceedings. Folklore suggests otherwise. Descendants interviewed in the 1930s recalled an old story, that when asked if she poisoned the feast, Sarah raised her head and answered, "I did what God would not." Others say she uttered only her daughter's name, Dinah, before falling silent again. Perhaps she spoke, perhaps she did not. The written record cannot decide. But silence itself was a kind of defiance, a refusal to dignify the performance of justice with her participation. The sentence was inevitable. Judge Whitfield declared, "For the heinous crime of murder by poison, this court condemns the said Negro woman Sarah to death by hanging. Sentence to be carried out at dawn on the third day hence, upon the grounds of Cedar Hill Plantation, in view of all." The cruelty of it was deliberate. Her execution would not be hidden in the courthouse yard. It would be staged on the land she had served, under the eyes of those she had fed, among the fields where she had buried her child. Letters from the Hollingsworth's kin in Louisiana reveal more of the mood than the court record itself. One written by the bride's uncle states, "Justice has been swift. Yet whispers abound that such insolence will spread unless stamped out. This trial must serve as example." The letter closes with chilling satisfaction. "We must remind them their place." And yet, even as the white community sought to erase her act by reducing it to a lesson, her presence in that courtroom became more than they intended. For the enslaved who crowded outside the courthouse windows, straining to hear, Sarah was no longer merely the cook. She was a symbol, her silence a weapon sharper than their master's words. WPA interviews decades later record one man recalling his grandfather's memory. "They say she never bowed her head, never cried. White folks wrote her down guilty, but to us she was already free." It is striking how the newspapers distorted the truth. The Natchez Gazette reported her trial not as the judgment of a woman, but as the necessary correction of property that had turned vicious. She was not called Sarah, not even given the dignity of a full name. She was a Negro wench. Her humanity stripped even in ink. But erasure has cracks. In a surviving church ledger from Yazoo City, the minister noted on March 31st, "Several Negroes came to service in deep distress, speaking of a woman condemned. They whispered prayers for her soul." That entry is the only sympathetic recognition of her humanity in the written record. Yet it tells us something vital, that even in silence, even as the law condemned her, Sarah remained alive in the hearts of those who saw her not as property but as kin. The trial ended quickly, but its echoes lingered. For white Yazoo County, it was a line drawn in blood, a warning that any act of defiance, however small, would meet with the rope. For the enslaved, it was a line of memory, a story whispered and retold, carrying with it both terror and pride. And so, as Sarah was led back to her cell, the courthouse doors slamming shut behind her, the record leaves us with questions it cannot answer. Did she regret her act? Did she grieve the lives lost alongside her masters? Or did she hold fast to the belief that vengeance, even in blood, was the only justice left? The courthouse burned years later during Reconstruction, taking with it most of the trial transcripts, most of the jury notes, most of the records that might have told us more. But perhaps the fire only mirrored what had always been true, that the system itself was built to erase her voice. And yet, against all odds, her silence still speaks. History is not lost by accident, it is buried. And the story of Sarah, the Hollingsworth cook, was no exception. After her hanging, her name began to vanish from ledgers, her trial notes crumbling into silence, her memory pushed into shadows where only whispers survived. The first act of erasure came from the Hollingsworth family itself. Surviving estate documents reveal meticulous attention to property and inheritance, yet between 1842 and 1843, there is a curious gap. An 1841 ledger lists, Cook Sarah, age approximately 37, valued at $800. By 1843, her name is gone, replaced with only the cold arithmetic of loss. One female Negro deceased. No mention of the trial. No mention of the deaths at the feast. Just subtraction. The local press followed suit. The Vicksburg Register, which had briefly reported the tragedy in Yazoo, carried no follow-up stories after the hanging. An editor's note tucked inside an April issue reads, "In matters of domestic tragedy, discretion must be observed for the maintenance of harmony." What harmony, one wonders, is served by silencing the dead. Court records fared no better. The Yazoo County Courthouse, where Sarah's trial was staged, burned in 1866. Reconstruction violence swept through Mississippi, and with it, flames devoured years of testimony. Officials claimed the fire was accidental. But a letter discovered in the papers of Judge Whitfield's descendants hints otherwise. Dated July 1866, it warns, "There are agitators among the freedmen seeking to exhume old grievances. The records of 4-2 should they resurface would incite unrest. Better ash than agitation." And so, ash is what we have. But even before the courthouse burned, there was deliberate suppression. Overseer diaries recovered from nearby plantations reveal a chilling strategy. One overseer at Shiloh Plantation wrote, "Word of poison spreads quickly. It must be quenched before it breeds imitation." He instructed neighboring planters to forbid the enslaved from speaking Sarah's name, threatening lashes for those who repeated her story. Silence was enforced with the whip. Yet silence never holds. In the WPA slave narratives collected almost a century later, fragments of her story broke through the cracks. An elderly woman named Louisa, interviewed in 1937, recalled, "They used to hush us when we talk about the cook who put death in the pots. They say don't call her name. But old folks whispered it anyhow. Said she stood straight at the rope. Said she ain't cry none." That memory, carried across generations, became its own form of record, oral testimony stronger than burned pages. The suppression was not only about erasing her act but also about reshaping it. In plantation folklore retold by white families, the massacre became distorted. A plantation diary from 1858 frames the tragedy not as resistance but as madness. Old tales speak of a negress gone deranged who poisoned the feast from envy, a warning of the dark mind ungoverned. In this telling, Sarah was no longer a woman grieving her children, no longer a cook wielding the only weapon left to her. She was madness incarnate, stripped of motive, her defiance rewritten as insanity. But hidden in the corners of black churches, her story carried a different tone. A hymnal book found in a rural congregation outside Yazoo contains a handwritten marginal note beside the hymn, "Go Down, Moses." The note reads, "Sing this for Sarah who struck Pharaoh at his feast." Here she was not madness, she was deliverer. In the space where official history sought to erase her, memory transformed her into a symbol of biblical retribution. What makes the suppression of Sarah's story so haunting is the precision of its erasure. Family Bibles, which often listed enslaved births and deaths, show entire pages torn out. In the Hollingsworth Bible preserved at a Louisiana archive, the years 1841 to 1843 are missing entirely, removed not by time but by hand. Was it shame? Was it fear of future generations asking questions? Or was it the stubborn desire to control a narrative that refused to stay buried? Even census records carry the silence. The 1850 slave schedules list the Hollingsworth estate owning 14 Negroes, ages ranging from 2 to 52. But the woman once named is now reduced to a markless number. Sarah once written was unwritten. And yet, suppression has limits. You can burn paper, but you cannot burn memory. A 1902 oral history recorded by a traveling preacher tells of the cook who poisoned the master's wine, and for one night the Lord balanced the scales. In this retelling, her act was sanctified. Her story became a ghost the Hollingsworth family could not kill. Why does this matter? Because suppression is never neutral. The erasure of Sarah's act was not just about protecting the reputation of one plantation. It was about protecting the entire system of slavery. If her story had survived in ink and record, it would have stood as undeniable proof that the enslaved did not simply endure. They resisted, they struck back, they seized justice when all other avenues were barred. To erase Sarah was to erase the possibility of defiance itself. But erasure never works perfectly. The courthouse may have burned, the Bible pages may have been torn, but her silence at trial, her defiance at the rope, her whispered memory in the cabins, these survived. And today, when we search the archives, we are struck less by what we find than by what is missing. The blank spaces themselves become evidence. Because sometimes the greatest testimony is silence. The silence of missing pages, of censored lines, of torn-out leaves. And in that silence, Sarah's voice is louder than ever. When history is smothered, memory slips into folklore. And for Sarah, the enslaved cook who poisoned the Hollingsworth wedding feast in 1842, her story did not end with ash and missing court files. It survived in whispers, in hymns sung off-key in the fields, in warnings mothers gave their children. To the planters, she was a curse never spoken. To the enslaved, she became a ghost who refused to rest. The first traces of her afterlife appear in songs. During the WPA slave interviews in the 1930s, one elderly man from Mississippi remembered a tune, sung low so the master won't hear, a work song with a peculiar refrain, "Don't eat at Pharaoh's table, don't drink Pharaoh's wine." When asked what it meant, he answered only, it was about a woman who fed death to the feast. Churches carried her memory too, but under the veil of scripture. A pastor's notebook preserved in a black church outside Vicksburg has scribbled lines beside the Exodus story, "Sarah struck at Pharaoh's supper. She is remembered." Here, her act was folded into biblical allegory, transformed from crime to deliverance. In Sunday sermons, she became a warning and a prophecy, proof that God sometimes worked through human hands, even hands forced into chains. Among white families, her name twisted into superstition. In plantation journals from the 1850s, one overseer wrote, "Our cooks are not to be trusted with the wine for fear of Sarah's hand in the cup." To them, she was not a woman but a curse, a dark whisper at the table. Parents warned their children not to leave food unattended, muttering, "Lest Sarah serve you." In their fear, they ensured her ghost was never forgotten. But it was in the cabins, away from the ears of the overseers, where her legend grew teeth. Elders told children that Sarah's spirit haunted feasts. "If you laugh too loud at the master's table," one old woman told the WPA interviewer, "Sarah will blow out your candle." For the enslaved, this ghost was not terror, it was justice. A spectral reminder that even in bondage, vengeance could be served. Stranger still are the stories of the Hollingsworth house itself. After the massacre, it was said no wedding there ever ended in joy. One guest account from 1859, buried in a private family letter, recalls, "At supper, a draught extinguished every candle at once, though no door was open. Some say it was the poisoned cook, restless still. Servants refused to enter the dining room after dark. The bride's chair remained empty at gatherings, avoided like a plague seat." In time, the story took on a name whispered only in the quarters, the feast ghost. Children dared each other to sneak scraps of food into the old kitchen, saying that if left overnight, they'd be gone by morning. Some claimed the pots still rattled on stormy nights, as though Sarah herself were stirring them again. Folklore has its own power. It carried Sarah's act farther than court transcripts ever could. Runaway ads from Louisiana in the 1840s and 50s mention cooks not to be trusted. The fear of poisoning spread plantation to plantation, carried not just by rumor but by belief. White planters suppressed the newspapers, but they could not suppress the stories told in firelight, in song, in trembling superstition. One remarkable fragment survives in a diary of a Union soldier stationed in Mississippi during the Civil War. In 1863 he wrote, "The Negroes tell of a woman who poisoned her master's wedding feast years past. They speak of her with reverence as one who stood against Pharaoh. Even 2 decades after her death, her ghost still marched beside them as the war tore slavery apart. Yet folklore is never static. By the 20th century, Sarah's name had blurred, but the legend remained. In rural Mississippi, some families still refused to eat food prepared by strangers at weddings, muttering, "Remember the feast." A 1911 local paper records a curious superstition among black families, a custom of sprinkling salt in wedding dishes to ward off the poisoner's ghost. The article mocks the practice, but in truth, it was memory disguised as ritual. This is what suppression failed to do. They could burn the courthouse, tear the Bible pages, and erase her name from ledgers. But folklore filled the silence. And in that folklore, Sarah became larger than life. She was no longer just a woman enslaved, forced into kitchens and fields. She became symbol, myth, ghost, prophet, a haunting that could not be erased. Even today, in some Mississippi oral traditions, old folks will tell you, "Don't sit at the table of those who whip you. Don't eat the food of those who own you." Sarah taught us that. Her story lingers like a shadow across centuries, not history as the archives write it, but history as memory keeps it. And in many ways that memory is more enduring than ink. Because folklore has no courthouse to burn, no ledger to destroy. It lives in the mouth, in the song, in the silence before grace is spoken over food. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. Sarah's ghost still sits at the table, a reminder that some stories refuse to die, no matter how deep you bury them. To the Hollingsworth family, to the white press, to the overseers who hushed whispers with the whip, Sarah was a lone anomaly. A woman gone mad in the kitchen. A freak occurrence best forgotten. But the truth, buried in scattered archives, runaway notices, and hushed testimonies, tells a different story. Sarah was not alone. Her act was part of a hidden pattern, one that rippled through the South, a quiet war fought with fire, blade, and poison. Consider Louisiana, 1833. Court transcripts from St. Mary Parish reveal the trial of an enslaved cook named Liza. The documents, fragmentary, weather-stained, record her confession under duress. "I put the powder in master's stew. I meant for him only." But the record cuts off mid-sentence, the rest lost to time. Newspaper clippings refer vaguely to a servant's derangement, but the whispers among freedmen decades later were sharper. Liza's stew killed not 1 but 3 men at the table. Go further back to Virginia in 1831, where the rebellion of Nat Turner drenched the fields in blood. Less known is that alongside the blades, there were rumors of planned poisonings, kitchens marked as battlegrounds as surely as the fields. Plantation diaries from Southampton County contain entries like this one, written weeks after Turner's uprising. "The Negro women must not be trusted with food unobserved. There is talk of powders in the broth." Even fear was a record, fear that resistance could spread like fire. And spread it did. A runaway advertisement in the Charleston Courier, dated 1840, describes an enslaved woman named Dinah, a skilled cook, suspected of poisoning. Her description reads as if cataloging property. About 35 years, scar on left cheek, knows the use of herbs. Yet hidden in the lines is testimony of suspicion, of resistance in the kitchen. Dinah was never recaptured. Her absence became another silence in the archives. Sarah's act in Mississippi was not a solitary spark but one flame among many. Across the South, kitchens became weapons. Recipes were rewritten in secret. Herbs gathered not just for healing but for vengeance. Sassafras, nightshade, tobacco leaves boiled into deadly strength, all whispered through cabins as if they were hymns. It was not madness but method. Even outside the kitchen, the enslaved found ways to strike back. Arson was common, though rarely recorded truthfully. A report from Georgia in 1845 describes accidental fire, destroying an entire cotton gin. Yet a letter tucked in the planter's private papers admits, it was deliberate. The Negroes lit it. Best not let this be known. Silence was safety, for the masters, not the enslaved. Folklore confirms what archives deny. In WPA interviews, freedmen recalled tales of men who slipped ground glass into overseers' coffee, of women who left fields to pour lye into milk jugs. Rarely did these stories reach newspapers. Rarely were names recorded. But the pattern is clear. Where there was bondage, there was resistance. To understand Sarah's place in this pattern is to see her not as anomaly but as echo. An echo of the Maroons in the swamps of Florida, who waged guerrilla war for decades. An echo of the poisoners in Louisiana, the arsonists in Georgia, the rebels in Virginia. Her feast was one strike in a war too vast for ledgers to contain. The suppression of her story, then, was not just about protecting the Hollingsworth name. It was about protecting the lie that enslaved people were passive, docile, submissive. To acknowledge Sarah was to acknowledge a battlefield that stretched from the kitchen to the courthouse, from whispered songs to open rebellion. To erase her was to erase the truth, that the enslaved fought back in every way they could. And if the records are thin, the gaps themselves are evidence. Too many courthouse fires, too many accidents, too many derangements, blamed on madness rather than defiance. Each silence is a fingerprint of suppression, each missing page a scar. Even into Reconstruction, fear of the pattern lingered. In an 1867 Freedmen's Bureau report, a white planter in Mississippi complained, "The Negro women speak of the cook who struck down Pharaoh. They say she was not alone. They say many more will follow her example." Fear survived longer than archives. Fear is its own kind of proof. Today, historians comb through fragments, runaway ads, estate ledgers, faded diaries, and the pattern emerges like a ghost. Sarah was one among dozens, perhaps hundreds, whose stories lie buried in silence. She was not madness. She was method. She was part of an unrecorded war. And that is the truth suppression tried hardest to bury. That slavery was never accepted quietly. That the enslaved never stopped resisting. That every kitchen, every field, every prayer meeting was a potential front in the war for survival and justice. Sarah's wedding feast was not the first nor the last. It was one voice in a chorus, one strike in a war, one story among many erased but never destroyed. And if you listen closely, in the silence of archives, in the hymns sung low, in the trembling fear of overseer diaries, you can still hear the pattern. You can still hear the resistance that refused to die. History does not end when the ink fades. It lingers in the silence, in the shadows, in the stories whispered when the overseer's back was turned. Sarah's story, the cook who poisoned the Hollingsworth wedding feast in 1842, was meant to be buried, erased by courthouse fires, excised from Bibles, swallowed by silence. Yet here it is clawing back into the light. We began with a feast, silver glinting, laughter echoing, the master's bride lifting her glass. By midnight, the laughter had turned to screams, the silver stained with bile, the bride writhing on the floor. According to that half-burned ledger, by morning 12 souls lay dead. This was not accident nor madness. It was deliberate. It was resistance carved into history with the only weapon left, food turned into vengeance. And though Sarah's body swung from the gallows, her act refused to die. It lived in fear, in overseers who warned each other to watch the kitchens. It lived in folklore, in songs about Pharaoh's table, in hymns scribbled with her name. It lived in silence, in the torn Bible pages, in the vanished court files. Suppression was proof of power, but also proof of terror. If she were meaningless, they would not have burned her records. If she were madness, they would not have silenced her name. Her story, fragmented as it is, forces us to confront what America prefers to forget. That slavery was not passive endurance, but constant rebellion. That the enslaved were not voiceless victims, but agents of their own resistance, their defiance carved into fields, fires, blades, and poisoned cups. To speak Sarah's name today is to challenge the myth that bondage was quietly accepted. It was not. The Hollingsworth family moved west after the war, their descendants scattering across Louisiana and Texas. In their telling, the wedding feast became a shameful secret, folded into silence. But in black communities, the story endured in another form. Old women whispered her name when warning children not to trust the master's table. Church hymns wove her into scripture. In folklore, she became the ghost at the feast, the spirit who blows out candles at tables of power, a reminder that justice may come, even if only for one night. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Sarah's act. She became more than a woman, more than a cook, more than a victim of the rope. She became a message, that even within the most suffocating chains, resistance is possible. That even silence carries memory. That the erased can return louder than before. Her story ends, but it does not close. Because the archives are still filled with silences, with names crossed out, with ledgers missing pages. How many other Sarahs were there? How many cooks, field hands, seamstresses, and preachers struck back in ways history refused to record? Each silence may be a massacre lost, a rebellion denied, a wedding feast never spoken of again. When you listen closely, you begin to hear them. In the firelight of oral stories. In the fear hidden between the lines of overseer diaries. In the fragments preserved by descendants who refused to forget. Sarah was not one. She was many. So tonight, as we close the file, the story does not return to the grave. It lingers, a shadow at the table, a ghost in the kitchen, A warning written not in ink but in blood and silence. If your family ever whispered about a feast, a death, or a name never spoken aloud, if you have seen a line in an old Bible scratched out or heard an elder say, "Don't eat from Pharaoh's table," write it below. And subscribe, because every story shared, every voice raised, drags another record back from the ash, and brings the buried history of resistance into the light. Sarah's name was meant to be forgotten, but now it is spoken again, and it will not be silenced.